Hello dear Motorsport Magazine friends and Formula One fans. It's not time yet, but the new 2024 Formula One season is of course just around the corner, and we want to bring you up to date with all the changes that will take place in Formula One in the new season. Now you're thinking there are none. You're not entirely wrong, but there are of course a lot of details that you may have missed because I filled up 2 complete index cards, so there's a lot there. If you're a real geek and want to show off your Formula One knowledge at dinner or in the pub, then this video is just the thing for you. Let's take a look at the technical side first. The technical rules were completely overhauled in 2022, the Great Revolution. It was therefore to be expected that not much would change. In 2023, there were a few minor adjustments to keep porpoising in check. In 2024, we will have to go into great detail to find changes. The drivers are a very interesting element. Porpoising was also a problem for the drivers. It was the heat in Qatar that caused particular problems for the drivers. There was actually supposed to be a change to this in 2023, but one team objected, and so the whole thing had to be postponed. After Qatar, the FIA said, no, definitely there has to be a change now. What am I talking about? A ventilation slot at the top of the chassis. It's optional, which means that the teams don't have to install it, but they can. It's really just a small slit. Most people might not even see it, but it allows the car to be additionally cooled. At the same time, of course, the opening at the front of the nose remains. This can still be used to cool the driver. You can also play a bit of ping pong, i.e. a bit of nose, a bit of chassis, however you like. Nothing is mandatory. That's in the current regulations. But then something else could be added. Nicolas Tombazis has revealed a very interesting detail to us. The FIA is tinkering a bit with various parameters, i.e. limit values for parameters. It was extremely hot in Qatar with high humidity and a demanding track. And the idea was that you could set certain limit values when these are reached, i.e. when the humidity is above a certain point, the temperature is above a certain point, and you say at the track, perhaps based on the G-forces and so on, you say it's extremely hot, then you want to allow the teams to increase the minimum weight by 2 kilograms, logically at very short notice because you can't predict that very well. And these 2 kilos must then be used to cool the driver. Of course, you could also add ballast, but that doesn't make much sense. Exactly what the teams will be allowed to do has not yet been decided. The limits have not yet been determined either. But it's a very interesting point. I'm looking forward to it. While we're on the subject of drivers, a little something else. You all know the biometric sensor that has been in the gloves for a few years now. There are now a few new features. It no longer has to be in the glove. It can also be placed in the underwear, for example. Then on the technical side, there are also mini changes to the front wing. Last year, the flexi wings were a big issue. The teams are continuing to put a stop to this. You can adjust the front wings to a certain extent. There now has to be a physical stop so that they can't bend beyond the point and so on. There are also a few adjustments to the floor. There are various metal parts, for example, around the control holes for the floor where overall on the floor, there are now restrictions on how much metal can be used and where. On the one hand, they want to make sure that the teams don't mess around with bending floors. And on the other hand, it's a safety-related issue because these metal parts could fly off relatively easily and are very, very heavy. So, of course, they are dangerous. Safety is always a major issue for the FIA. There are stricter regulations for the roll bars. That has been clear for some time. Since Guan Yu Zhou's accident, the requirements have gradually become stricter. So the first step in 2023 and the second and for the time being the last step in this direction in 2024. Then of course there is a lot of small print. I don't think even the most hardened geek would be interested in that. It's things like a new aluminum powder is allowed for additive manufacturing, i.e. for the 3D printers. Gear ratios of the customer teams may be chosen to a certain extent. They are allowed to use an older specification and so on. So these are all real absolute subtleties that probably don't even really interest the freaks. But there are actually 2 interesting non-changes that have been removed. The ban on tire blankets was actually due to come in 2024, but that was dropped. The teams agreed on this. After the tests, they said, no, we're not happy with that. So heating blankets will stay in 2024 for everyone who might have gotten a bit confused. And the digital rims are also not coming. Maybe you've never heard of them. But the original plan was to start the new car generation with digital rims. They would have been able to display information about the cars and drivers for the fans at the track. You may never have seen that before. I was lucky enough to have seen it once by chance. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to publish the photo. In any case, it has been postponed again or deleted from the regulations for the time being. Very importantly, it's not the rim itself, but the wheel covers, which currently cover the relatively beautiful rims in a relatively unattractive way. So much for the technical side. Let's take a look at the sporting side. And now you're curious, what about the sprint format? Well, in 2023, there was already a change to the sprint shootout, and the sprint is no longer the qualifying for the Grand Prix. I still can't tell you what the whole thing will look like in 2024. They want to make changes. The most likely at the moment is that there will be a first free practice session on Friday, followed by the sprint shootout. Then there will be the sprint on Saturday morning, qualifying on Saturday afternoon, and qualifying will determine the starting grid for the Grand Prix on Sunday. That way it's a bit better organized, so there's no longer this mixture of qualifying for the Grand Prix at the beginning, then a sprint on Saturday, and then the Grand Prix again. That's the most likely option at the moment, but it's not fixed yet. Reverse grid is also still being discussed. Then the ATA was removed from the sporting regulations, which had been tried twice in 2023, the alternative tire allocation, which the teams didn't quite like so much. So in 2024, everything remains with the 13 sets of tires on the normal Grand Prix weekends and 12 sets on the sprint weekends. And then, while we're on the subject of such great acronyms as ATA, let's move on to TPC, testing of previous cars. In today's Formula One, testing is very, very strictly regulated, forbidden with the current car, but you are allowed to drive older cars. And that's a very interesting point because up to now it's always slipped up. A year, the 2021 cars were allowed to drive in the past season, now 2022 cars. And that's a very interesting point because the 2022 cars are ground effect cars. This means that if a team wants to prepare a young driver for a Formula One season, for example, they can now use a ground effect car. Of course, this is particularly interesting for larger teams. I recently visited Maranello and they built a 2022 car for precisely this reason. While we're on the subject of test drives, let's take a look at the promotional events. They were previously regulated to 100 kilometers, now it's 200 kilometers. The tire test days for Pirelli have been increased from 35 to 40 days, and there are also 4 mudguard test days included in the regulations. With mudguard, I mean these spray guards, i.e. these baffles or the plates, are to be tested to prevent the spray. I almost forgot one very important thing at this point, namely the engine components. Why did I almost forget them? On the one hand, they are technical, but in this case it's actually about the sporting regulations. It's about the quota and exceeding the quota. The quota has been adjusted downwards a little. There are now only 3 combustion engines, 3 turbochargers, 3 MGU-Hs and 3 MGU-Ks. There is 1 less of each component than in the previous season. In 2021, we were already at exactly this quota. Then they went up for the new regulations, and now the whole thing is being adjusted downwards again. For the other components, i.e. control units, batteries, and exhaust systems, everything remains the same. There are also a lot of little things again, such as the notification for a standing restart now only has to be given 1 minute beforehand and not 2 minutes. Curfews have been adjusted a little again. Closed events no longer exist. There are now only open events. This means that the pandemic is now officially over in Formula One. So lots of little things too. Here are perhaps a few of the more interesting things. The pit lane opens 10 minutes later than before. The start procedure has been extended a little so that the cars and hopefully the drivers are on the grid for longer. But the whole thing was too long. The drivers then all went back to the garage or their motorhomes or wherever and only came back for the anthem. So 50 minutes, now 40 again. At the same time, another very interesting point about aerodynamics. The next rule revolution is coming in 2026, and the teams are not allowed to make developments on the aerodynamic side in 2024, both in the wind tunnel and via CFD. And then we talk a bit about the money. Entry fees have been raised again, so the FIA is making good money out of it. But of course, they also have to earn money from it in order to reinvest in the sport and monitor the whole thing. And while we're on the subject of money, let's also talk about the right of review. Strictly speaking, this is not in the F1 regulations, but in the International Sporting Code, the overarching regulations for all racing series. The FIA now also wants money for it. It used to be free of a fee, but that's not the only thing that has changed. The deadline has also changed. Previously, you had 2 weeks to apply for this right of review. Now it's just 4 days, except in special cases when the stewards say it was not possible within these 4 days, then there is another 24-hour grace period. I don't quite understand that. But the right of review should perhaps be reconsidered in Formula One in general, because it doesn't really make much sense. But it does make a lot of sense if you still haven't bought Christmas presents for your loved ones. Depending on when you watch the video, whether you watch it before Christmas or after, if you haven't got any Christmas presents yet, now is the time. Of course, we have a tip for you, gutschein.motorsportmagazin.com. Of course, we can't deliver the whole thing in time. That's why you have to print out this voucher yourself at home, print at home. But well, the way printers are these days, that's quite a hurdle. Nevertheless, if you watch the whole video after Christmas, you can of course give yourself a present. Maybe you've been given money or whatever. Then a print subscription is something really nice. You can then enjoy this great print product 6 times a year. But now let's get back to the changes for 2024 and take a look at the calendar, record race calendar. You almost can't hear it anymore. It was supposed to be there every now and then, but then came COVID and then came something again. And yes, unfortunately, Imola has been cancelled this year due to the flooding there. We really should see 24 races in 2024. On the one hand, China is returning to the calendar. On the other hand, Imola should have been there too. Let's hope it doesn't get cancelled. Those are the 2 new races that will take place in 2024. But that's not the only thing. The season starts very, very early. On the 2nd of March in Bahrain, then it's straight to Saudi Arabia on the 9th of March. And whoever has the calendar in their head now will have noticed that these are Saturdays. That is correct. These are not the first Formula One races to be held on Saturdays. But in modern Formula One, yes, well, we've had Las Vegas. But there is another reason for this, namely the month of Ramadan begins, and before the fasting month begins, you want to have the races there in the Middle East region. That's why the calendar had to be changed a bit. After Saudi Arabia, we have Australia. Japan has been moved to the front, but not back-to-back, but always with a week's break. China, Miami, then the European season opener in Imola, then comes the entire European season with Montreal clapped back in at some point in between. The European season finale is in Monza. We'll also have the usual summer break, and then things will get a bit wild in this racing calendar. Then comes the doubleheader with Baku and Singapore. That's not so wild yet, but then there's a month's break. That means we have a summer break, and then we have another month's break shortly afterwards. Then comes the triple header with Austin, Mexico, Brazil. Then we have another 3-week break, and then we have the triple header with Las Vegas, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. So let's say we have an interesting racing calendar, and now you're interested to know where the sprints will take place. That was decided a few weeks ago in China, in Miami, in Austria. That's the first half of the season. And then in Austin, Sao Paulo, and Qatar. So much for the racing calendar. Now let's take a look at the driver market. And now you're saying, wait a minute, I can switch off. Everything will stay the same in 2024. That's also correct if you look at the driver pairings or the drivers at the end of the season. Nyck de Vries is no longer in F1. Liam Lawson is no longer on the grid. But the drivers, as they were on the grid in Abu Dhabi, will still be on the grid in 2024. But watch out, yes, Mick Schumacher is still a reserve driver for Mercedes and also drives in the World Endurance Championship for Alpine. But that's not what I was getting at. The most exciting thing will be the driver market. Many, many contracts expire in 2024, including that of Sergio Perez, both Ferrari drivers, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon, possibly Pierre Gasly, who still has an option, both AlphaTauri drivers, Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. Both Williams drivers, both Sauber drivers, both Haas drivers. So there's a lot going on. Fred Vasseur has told us that Ferrari's aim is to perhaps finalize 1 or 2 contracts before the start of the season. Depending on when you watch the video, the Ferrari thing may no longer be quite so topical. But the question is, how long are these contracts? Because we all know that the big revolution will come in 2026. More contracts will expire in 2025. The question is whether transitional contracts will be signed now and then. The big shake-up on the driver market will be postponed a little in 2026. Of course, we'll let you know all about it when something happens there. But for now, have a Merry Christmas if you saw the video before Christmas Eve. I hope you had a great time with your family and loved ones. Then, of course, I wish you a Happy New Year. But I also hope that we'll see each other again before then, because I've already recorded a lot of videos with my lovely colleagues, both on the couch next door and here at the desk, which we produced for you before the turn of the year. There'll be plenty after that too. And if you don't want to miss out, be sure to subscribe to all our channels. We have more than 200,000 here, so it would be nice if we could reach 205,000 in the new year, maybe even a bit more. and the other channels are also doing really well. So be sure to watch them too if you want to be well entertained between the years. Want to be entertained? What's that called? So watch them too if you want to be well entertained between the years. Want to be entertained.